I'm going to be talking about the ITF's People's Public Transport Policy. A massive improvement and expansion of public transport is the only real alternative to private cars. Modal shift on a significant scale must occur to reduce transport emissions and meet the commitments of the Paris Agreement. Inadequacy of the national commitments at the heart of the Paris Agreement is particularly striking in the case of transport. The gap between what needs to be done and what is actually happening is especially wide and getting wider. High-quality public transport investments, which integrate different modes combined with walking and cycling, will create millions of direct and indirect jobs, while also improving urban life and reducing emissions. Of course, this is very important to us as trade unions, and we need to organise to ensure that these are decent jobs with organisational and employment rights for our members. But the climate crisis gives us an opportunity not only to address employment issues, but also to demand the redistribution of power and resources and challenge the conventional understanding of economic growth and mantra of private ownership. Only if we address the issue of public ownership can the delivery of the economic, social, environmental, and employment benefits of public transport for all be guaranteed. If public transport services are run privately, then decision-making is based on the need to generate profits, rather than meeting the needs of low-income users and workers for affordable mobility and decent jobs. Alternative models of ownership must also embed democratic participation by trade unions and community organizations in decision-making about public transport planning and policy. As the ITF, we contest the market-based approach as a solution to the existing crisis in public transport. I want to highlight three elements of this crisis. Firstly, public transport is not expanding fast enough to cut emissions in line with climate science. And as a result of COVID-19, there's a strong possibility that the modal share of public transport drops even further. Secondly, public transport is not expanding fast enough to meet the needs of cities. Millions of people still do not have access or are too poor to afford public transport in the global south. And there is serious congestion and pollution affecting the quality of life for millions of people. Thirdly, workers' terms and conditions have declined. Employment is less secure, with competition between public and private operators causing a race to the bottom. And millions of workers are still in informal employment. To address this crisis, the ITF has developed pro-public policy proposals that give us a more authoritative voice. We have a comprehensive people's public transport policy covering public ownership, public financing, worker control of technology, gender equality, climate and decarbonisation, employment and decent work. I will focus on our policy demands linked to climate and decarbonisation. However, these cannot be seen in isolation of our wider policy proposals, including that public transport services must be publicly owned and operated, democratic accountability in the planning, development, and future of public transport must be guaranteed, and investment in public transport must be prioritised, and public finance models must be promoted. When it comes to climate, we are demanding that governments take a whole economy approach to reducing transport emissions. Reducing emissions from transport will only be part of a successful energy transition if emissions in other key sectors, like electrical power generation, industry, buildings, food and agriculture, are also reduced. We also have proposals for the electrification of public transport with a guaranteed just transition for workers. And you can learn more about these proposals in the additional materials section of this video lecture. The shift to a cleaner, greener, electric public transport will require a considerable increase in power generation. The electrification of rail and buses should be a top priority for governments and employers, because when electrification is applied with the decarbonisation of the electricity supply through a massive expansion of renewable energy, big gains in emission reductions can be achieved. I want to emphasize that this does not mean that switching to electric cars is the solution. Our policy also emphasizes an integrated public goods approach to transport and energy democracy. Transport unions have a role in the struggle for energy democracy and publicly owned renewable power. Both the power sector and transport sector must have more democratic participation and public ownership so that the decarbonisation of both sectors can proceed unhindered in a planned and coordinated way. We all have to be concerned with how energy is produced, regardless of the sector we organise in, because there cannot be a just transition unless there is energy democracy, a decisive shift in power towards workers, communities and the public. I would also like to highlight how this policy was developed. We brought groups of unions together to talk about what they wanted in the policy, based on the unique knowledge and skills that their members have on how to improve public transport. We then worked with external organisations on policy chapters. We used the chapters to have political discussions and decide policy proposals. And now that the policy is complete, we're using it as an educational tool to stimulate policy discussions amongst union members around the world. I want to emphasise that this is not an abstract set of ideas which is separate from current struggles and issues facing public transport unions. Our strategy links current demands to this long-term vision of a publicly owned and democratically controlled public transport system based on principles of climate and social justice. To access the People's Public Transport Policy, please go to www.optpolicy.org.